26th day, Upper Water Month, 0 CE. Dozens of warbands trickled in over the next day, gratefully taking shelter within the embankments and dry shelters raised by Karavaki and the other casters in Soraka's entourage. Despite making their way through kilometers of waterlogged jungle and forest, they appeared wet and miserable coming in, but otherwise in good condition. Of the Yorgulan pursuers, there was no sign. "They can't just be letting us go like this," Rana Saj snarled over the roar of the nearby waters. "It's difficult to detect anything in these conditions," Soraka said. "Hunters can see much, but they cannot see below the water's surface." The way ahead had been scouted as well, with Kasturi and her gladestalkers reporting little of note beyond the destruction wrought by the out-of-season torrent. Everything pointed to another possibility that he hadn't considered before. "This plan of theirs clearly doesn't flow along the lines of Green Dragon thinking," Soraka said. "That Yeti Lord is probably responsible for most of what's happening. I find it hard to believe that he could convince dragons to work for him," Rana Saj said. "It's not as far-fetched as you might imagine. To many, dragons are legendary beings, but they are in reality just another heteromorphic race. They have goals, desires and preferences much like any other." "So you think he's manipulating the Yorgulans to serve his own ends?" "Well, manipulation is unnecessary in this case. We've been treating the Yeti as side players in this conflict, but if we assume that they've been directing most of this, the way the Yorgulan front is being used changes drastically. The Yeti only need to convince the Yorgulans that working with them is in their best interests." The plain mismatch between the broadly passive nature of dragonkind versus the highly aggressive character of the ongoing Yorgulan assault had bothered him since the withdrawal had been called. If one put the Yeti Lord in control of the Yorgulan's actions, however, several disturbing possibilities came to light. "And what would in their best interests entail?" Rana Saj asked. "One possibility is that the dragons are being paid to act out their part of the strategy, but I find that highly unlikely. The ice fields of the walled spine are not known for their wealth. Most likely is that the idea of a permanent occupation is being dangled in front of the Yorgulans." Rana Saj turned his gaze to the flooded forest below. "Permanent occupation, of this pass? Of Rolengork? What?" The Barlord turned an incredulous look on Soraka. Several of the warriors around them rose at the clan lord's alarm. "I'm afraid I don't possess the faculties to make that connection, Soraka," Rana Saj said. "What led you to this conclusion?" "It's not a conclusion yet," Soraka replied. "I'm just trying to figure out what would hurt Rolengork the most and how this Yeti Lord might achieve it. We would be fools to believe that it wouldn't happen if it was possible." "Then what is it that you see?" "I'm simply weighing benefits and detriments," Soraka said. "The Yeti are in an advantageous diplomatic position. Yeti do not inhabit the same environment as the Yorgulans, so they'll happily concede territories that they have no use for. By the same token, this overcomes the single greatest obstacle when it comes to dealing with green dragons: trust. Both sides understand that there can be no lasting motive to betray the other, they are simply using one another to achieve their respective territorial goals." "So an extension of the idea that you presented initially?" "Yes. Tell me, how far to the west does the walled spine extend?" "That would depend on what you define as the walled spine, but the mountainous wildland stretches all the way to the territory of the Wyvern Rider tribes beyond our northwestern border. Glaciers and ice fields can be seen for most of that distance." "Well, that's a problem. Without the means to counter-control weather, Rolengork's northern frontier was at the mercy of the Yeti." Soraka's mind worked to identify potential solutions, but his lack of familiarity with the region only left him with vague ideas. "Is an alliance with your northern neighbors possible?" he asked. "The Yeti are a common enemy in this case." "There is no account of anything resembling diplomacy with the wilderness tribes," Rana Saj answered. "Not even trade. They are entirely hostile to us." "What about dragons? You have them to the east, south and southwest, but not the north?" "We've had no sightings of dragons in the north in all of our history." "Giants?" Rana Saj shook his head. "How can that be?" The only answer was that the cycle of 2 centuries ago wiped them all out. Soraka had only ever come across evidence of one other calamity that was so universally thorough, and even that hadn't been over such a wide area. At least they hadn't ended up like the countries around Mount Ketenias. "Revisiting an old idea," Rana Saj said. How would killing their ritualists affect their ability to influence the theater? That's a good question, Soraka replied. It might not help you right at this moment, but it would definitely give them second thoughts about doing it again. How the Yeti would recover from any losses of powerful mystics depended on how they cultivated them in the first place. Access to magic of the third tier and above was something of a puzzle for many demi-human species. Many self-reliant demi-human societies eventually developed a rudimentary mystic caste that had strict rules for what behaviors its members were allowed to engage in. This helped tremendously in producing individuals capable of third-tier magic, but those capable of the fourth were still exceedingly rare. There were other avenues, just as breeding specialized lineages and working with other races, but they saw no evidence of that amongst the Yeti tribes. If we do it enough, Rana Saj growled, they won't be able to do it at all. We just have to figure out effective ways to pull it off. Soraka nodded at the Rana's resolute statement. Rather than bemoan their situation or cast blame upon others, he simply did his best to address the problem. It was proper conduct for the ruling warrior caste. They remained at their camp for an additional day, which had Karavaki and the other casters turned the craggy island they were sheltering on into a respectable, albeit cramped, fortress. When the trickle of warbands coming to join them came to an apparent end, Rana Saj almost looked hesitant to move on. I'll have to get my mystics to figure out how to do this, the Rana said as he looked down at the network of well-drained trenches and stone bunkers. It seems that anything goes with magic. Some avenues of development are more useful than others, Soraka said. I've seen more than my fair share of crazy ideas that go nowhere. Still no sign of the Ogulans? None, Rana Saj replied. We've consolidated into a dozen positions along the tree line and none of them have come under attack. You'd think they'd be using this opportunity to drop more cock on us. That's just the way things are sometimes. What may seem obvious to one side is not to the other. We also don't know what their circumstances are or whether there's something else at work here. Though it was early morning, the magically induced weather kept things dark. While Rana Saj's forces had rested, scouts went to pick out the most stable route west, leading them over a less than reliable-looking route of stone recently exposed by the hundreds of mudslides caused by the flooding. When they crossed into the area affected by control weather, they were thoroughly soaked within half a minute. Remind me to thank our druids that this never happens at home, Jaraku said. A disparity in power has too great of an effect here, Soraka wiped his soaked whiskers. Sixth-tier magic turns one into a veritable god. He could only imagine that most who achieved Roti-class levels of power in the region would quickly become full of themselves and try to impose their will upon others through brute strength. Or they would use their power to pursue purely selfish ends. It was one of the most understated aspects that defined the difference between those who lived in civilized lands and the savages that lived beyond them. Beings who believed that they existed independent of the world around them were some of the vilest individuals to exist, and they could be found everywhere in the unknown fringes of the world. The first sign that something was amiss happened 2 hours into their slog through the relentless downpour, or rather, they were attacked. An Ophidian lunged out of the water during one of their crossings and latched onto a Kira warrior. As the two combatants wrestled with one another, an Icani caught the struggling Bar by the ankles and dragged him under the surface. Bullets splashed into the water as nearby Kira warriors loosed their slings too late. Yorgulan's in the water. Rana Saj called out, keep crossing, but stay alert. Hunters, cover our people from the bank. The warbands rushed to organize themselves. Soraka eyed the line of hunters with a sense of growing dread. Rana Saj, no. That's a TR. Hundreds of Vikani exploded out of the rushing waters. They locked onto the Kira hunters lined up neatly along the shore with their powerful claws. The warriors who reacted to assist them were similarly overwhelmed, disappearing into the churning waters. A second wave of Vikani appeared shortly after, advancing up the bank block of the ford. Gladestalkers, can you hit them from here? No problem, Kasturi called out. Clear those crayfish away. We're staying on this side until the rest of the warbands have made it over. His bodyguard tightened ranks, forming a defensive screen between the Gladestalkers and the nearby shore. Bullets whistled across the shallow ravine to smash into Icani, who were busy paying attention to the Kira attempting to fight their way through. Is that all there is to this ambush? Not that it wasn't bad enough. Nearly 300 Kira warriors had disappeared in seconds. Dragon overhead. He looked up just in time to see a winged silhouette moving through the low clouds. Half of the Kira warriors broke and fled in all directions. Those that ran too close to the water were set upon by Icani and Ophidians waiting in ambush. A pair of large black objects plopped into the water upstream. Cock in the water, coming our way. The two insectoids bobbed and swirled in the violent current, evading the first two attempts at striking them more through luck than skill. An Ophidian popped out of the water and grabbed one, cocking its arm to throw it at the warriors along the shore. A bullet found the cock before it could be released. The explosion washed over the water, too far to be harmful to anyone except for the hapless Ophidian that was holding the cock. A second Ophidian appeared a few seconds later, attempting to throw the second cock at them. This time, a bullet turned its head into a spray of gore. The cock dropped back into the water and kept floating along. A third Ophidian picked it up and was subjected to another lethal bullet. "Well, that's sort of funny," Jaraka said. 24 Ophidians met their end attempting to throw the exploding insectoid before the cock harmlessly floated downstream. The Kira warriors awaiting their turn to make the crossing could only laugh at the scene. "Keep going," Soraka told them. "We'll cross last." The Yorgulan ambushers were suppressed not long after. He wasn't sure how many were prudently staying underwater nearby. The Green Dragon didn't appear again, but the threat that it represented to Clan Kira's warriors even without attacking directly was made clear. They caught up to Rana Saj 30 minutes later. The Lord of the Kira stormed forward, anger simmering in his silver eyes. "Remind me why I thought they would be chasing us from behind." "A simple premise set by the opening skirmishes," Soraka said. "Even experienced commanders will fall for it." "But you realized what was going on," Rana Saj noted. "As a veteran of this front, I should have seen it. I even talked about my son overcoming a similar ambush not so long ago." "I realized it too late," Soraka replied. "Acting as a commander when fighting multiple races is an extraordinarily difficult task. We came here to fight the Yorgulans, and then we were thinking about what the known Yorgulan races here would do when it was the Yeti who probably came up with the strategy. Then, when we switched to figuring out what the Yeti were doing, the Yorgulans did things their own way. It was a strength that came with forming coalitions of different races. Wildly different tactics, strategies and modes of thinking were part and parcel of having a wide variety of racial traits and behaviors at one's disposal. It created situations that were difficult for commanders to adequately process. "I'm starting to dread the outcome of this withdrawal," Rana Saj said. "If this is happening everywhere." "If it was happening everywhere, Clan Kira would be decimated. If the Yeti maintained ideal conditions for the Yorgulans year-round, Rolengork would not be able to retake the pass. Their ascent eventually brought them to a point where the cumulative rainfall was insufficient to flood the waterways. At the top of the pass, Rana Saj visibly relaxed, letting out a tired sigh. Soraka, however, narrowed his eyes as he looked westward. "We can't stop here," he said. "It looks like they're flooding both sides of the pass. When it rains, it pours." Soraka shot Jaraka a look. "What are your flood countermeasures like, Rana Saj?" "We get out of the way," the Rana replied. "It's supposed to be the dry season right now, so things shouldn't be so bad. Assuming this is a short-term thing." A 2-day forced march finally saw them well below the tree line on the western side of the pass. They camped on a rugged hill familiar to Rolengork's defenders, settling in to recuperate from their ordeals. Soraka kept his eye on the skies, waiting to see if the altered weather would persist. Late that evening, while watching the churning skies away from the resting warbands, Karavaki came out to join him. His second wife sat down on the boulder he had picked out for himself, leaning lightly against his shoulder. "Do you want us to stop it?" Karavaki asked. "You know the answer to that question," Soraka answered. "Some may call it cruelty. The cold, unfeeling gaze of one who looks upon the struggles of others from above. It is not our doing, and it is not our place to intercede. Besides, a crisis brings out the true nature of a society and its members. If we are to ultimately act in their favor, it's the fastest way to come to that conclusion." Karavaki and the other divine casters could, of course, conduct a ritual of their own to counter the ongoing control weather effect. One could even argue that they were simply restoring the balance of nature. Doing so, however, would add a foreign element, one that arbitrarily negated the efforts of other parties involved in the conflict. "Well, You seem to favor them so far, Kawabaki said. At least those of the warrior castes. And why not? Soraka replied, they may not be enlightened, but they still exhibit many positive qualities. It is always gratifying to discover that a people have already embarked upon a righteous path. I don't disagree, Kawabaki said. But remember our findings from before our arrival in Kira. And remember what Rana Saj said when he invited us to accompany him on his campaign. Rolengork is far from a monolith. Nor would I expect a country this large to be, Soraka replied. Let's keep our findings partitioned, yes? The actions of the few should not damn the many. Those actions could just as well be driven by ignorance. Given the way that civilization developed in Rolengork, he expected a fair number of practices that would be considered barbaric elsewhere. Much to everyone's relief, the clouds dissipated on the 8th day after their appearance. That in itself, however, left them with unanswered questions. Why didn't they press their advantage? Rana Saj said as they resumed their march back to Gaulia, I don't know why, but it makes me angry that they didn't. Probably because you understand that it's a wasted opportunity, Soraka said. But, one should not question their fortune too much, I think. I still need to figure out what to report to the council. It's going to be especially embarrassing since Rana Ori will have probably delivered the recommendation for a bolstered offensive just before that. On that note, this puts us in a terrible position for the long term. Soraka nodded in silent agreement. It was too perfect of an arrangement for the Yorgulans. While the Yeti Lord's gains in the walled spine were a matter of great concern, greater still was the fact that the green dragons of the Yorgulan Commonwealth had bought critical time for themselves to grow more powerful than Rolengork could handle. So long as the Yeti and Yorgulans continued to cooperate, Rolengork would be stuck on the defensive. Well, who knows what time will bring, Soraka said. Older dragons, Rana Saj replied. He chuckled at the Rana's resilient sense of humor. Your expansion to the west and resulting access to the sea will offer opportunities to cultivate strength through other means. Trade, diplomacy, who knows, you may find powerful allies that stand to gain from cooperation with Rolengork. Perhaps, Rana Saj said. We are not of the mind that the world is so kind, however. Rolengork has always been alone. There are many barriers to relations between nations to overcome, Soraka said. Especially if the respective races involved have differences that tend to put them at odds with one another. But the fact of the matter is that the world is home to many. Collaboration is often more efficient than conflict when it comes to achieving one's goals. What you say is difficult to imagine when the entire world is seemingly out to eat us, push us out of our lands or take advantage of us in some way. It's not an easy thing for a people to grasp, I agree. A proper sense of order is crucial. This is not as simple as saying so, of course. The Beastman Confederacy took many centuries to become what it is today, even with so many races coming together as its citizens. 700 years ago, we were not so different from Rolengork. 700 years is a long time, Soraka, Rana Saj said. Enough for nations to rise and fall many times over. Indeed, but it does not need to take 700 years. As much as I would like to say that it is only a matter of effort, however, it is just as often subject to the whims of fate. In a way, the powers in the central regions of the continent should be thankful that they have so many rivals to keep one another sharp. Are you saying that it's fine for Rolengork to have many powerful enemies? Rana Saj asked. Enemies, rivals, competitors, they all serve to keep one from falling into decadence and decay. They are often more reliable than friends, in a way. Being constantly exposed to the truths of the world is instrumental to understanding what it is that truly matters. A society can drift very far from those truths as the generations pass. And where would you say we stand, Soraka? How far are we from these truths? I would say a few of them are smashing you right in the muzzle right now, Soraka replied wryly, but don't let that blind you to the rest. There are many directions in which you might drift, and some drift so far that they attempt to deny reality itself. It's not pretty when the world comes to dissuade them of their delusions. Understanding cosmic order and how it applied to one's life was central to achieving enlightenment. It was a journey that lasted through the many cycles of one's existence. Similarly, a nation achieving a state of enlightened order also had to constantly maintain it. It could be lost much more easily than it was obtained, and the chaos that followed such a fall was a hell in itself. That sounds like Draconic Kingdom, Rana Saj said, putting up a desperate facade in order to dissuade its neighbors from visiting the truth upon it. He still had his doubts about that. One did not simply tie the fate of their nation to a grand bluff. There had to be more to it. They returned to Gaulia over 3 weeks from the time of their departure. Soraka mostly left Rana Saj alone as the Lord of the Kira saw to the aftermath of his all-too-brief winter campaign. Out of the 30,000 warriors that set forth from the city of Kira, only 15,000 remained. It was a crippling blow to Rolengork's ability to support its eastern territories from militant incursions. At the same time, Soraka was certain it was merely first blood in a long, defensive battle against the Yeti of the Waldspine and the Yorgulan Commonwealth. "And here I thought I would be peddling wares for the next 3 months," Davy said when they gathered in their fortress accommodations. "A certain furry friend has robbed you of that particular joy," Soraka replied. "Clan Kira will hold their positions on this side of the pass, but we'll be heading back to Kira with Rana Saj when he goes to deliver his report to Rolengork's presiding council." "What happened?" "Other people had plans of their own. We have a good idea of how the warrior clans here behave, so we'll be heading back to the interior to see how the rest of the country acts. Back to the civilization that you adore." "Such that it is," Davy rolled her eyes. "I suppose I should be thankful that we won't be camping out anymore." Rana Saj was ready to leave the fortress by the end of the day. With only his bodyguard to accompany him, they made good time on their return to Kira. The events of the past weeks kept him too busy to attend to the mundane affairs awaiting him in his clanhold, but he did stop to offer hospitality to Soraka and his entourage. On the eve of Rana Saj's departure to Khorstorofi Keral, the Bar Lord invited Soraka to dine with him. Rana Saj received him on a balcony overlooking the city and the lake, looking a bit odd without the equipment he had been wearing for most of their time together. For the first time, Soraka sensed the weariness caused by the burden on the Rana's shoulders. His broad frame and striped tail drooped, and the expression on his face was one of a leader with no answers to his mounting problems. "What a poor showing that was," he muttered. "On the contrary," Soraka said. "You acquitted yourselves well, given the circumstances." "Even if that's the case," the Rana replied, "I don't feel it. We were so confident that this winter would be just like every other. Complacent. Now, 2 of the warrior clans have been decimated with little to show for it. What a farce. You cannot account for the unprecedented. Those who have the audacity to criticize you for the results are fools who would do no better in the same situation, and likely worse. All you can do is take what you've learned and apply whatever effective action you can devise. There's no point in beating yourself up over the past, especially when you have a duty to face the future." Rana Saj remained silent as he gazed out over his city. A small amount of chaos erupted amongst the citizenry when those who moved down the receding river banks for the winter were suddenly forced out of their homes by unexpected flooding. It was not as bad as it was upstream, and it at least served as a warning for what might come. The Barlord's brooding was interrupted by a handful of servants who brought in their evening meal. He seemed to shake away the malaise that had settled over him, walking over to a small table near the balcony railing. "I wonder if my father would mind us using this table," he said as he placed a paw upon the polished ebony. Soraka walked over to join him, his eyes tracing over the table's unadorned surface. "Is there some significance to it? My father often sat in this seat here." The Rana's paw went to rest on one of the chairs tucked under the table. "I've never seen the other occupied. When I asked him why that was, he told me that it was for a friend that he made far abroad. I suppose he made some silly promise to him - you'll always have a seat at my table or some such. He always spoke fondly of the Confederacy, regaled us with tales of his time there. Of the wonders that he had seen, a shining civilization the likes of which we here in our jungle couldn't even dream. Of the great ruler who took him into his hold and opened his eyes to what the future could bring. He even fought in a war with him, if I recall correctly." "That was before I was born," Soraka said, "but my father told me of his time with Goro, as well." "So it's all true, then?" Soraka chuckled at the recollection of some of those tales. "Well, I'm not exactly sure what your father told you, but they did end up on all sorts of strange adventures." "I see," Rana Saj said. "I do not believe my father a liar, but I always wondered if those tales were merely stories spun to inspire his family to aspire to greater things, to look beyond the everyday life that we have here. What he spoke of was so much larger than us that we could scarcely believe it. And that longing that he has to see it all again, I just couldn't understand, but I think I do now, if only just a bit. Rana Saj pulled out Goro's chair, settling into it as he gestured to the seat across from him. You've saved my life multiple times now, he said. Not just my life, but the lives of tens of thousands of my people. We owe you a great debt, Soraka of Gond. You will always be welcome at our table. I'm uncertain if I'll ever be able to collect on that debt. Soraka went and sat down across from Rana Saj, so consider it a token of our friendship. 18th day, Middle Water Month, 0C. Soraka wasn't sure if he would meet Rana Saj again, but they had a lot of Rolengork to cover. Beyond its western border was the Draconic Kingdom, which he was also keenly interested in paying a visit to. Including the stops that they made at the settlements along the way, their journey down the river took 3 weeks to travel the 600 kilometers between Kira and the central regions of the country. Needless to say, Davy made full use of their vessels, filling them with city-manufactured goods to trade in the towns along the way and exchanging them for raw materials to trade in the cities. It was an oddly comforting process to experience, probably because she did it everywhere they went. As for the impact of the magically induced storms on the Yorgulan border, they grew less and less pronounced the wider the river became. The dry season did periodically experience downpours, so none of the locals seemed to attach any significance to the event. I know this should be expected, Mitra said, but doesn't it seem a bit sad? Soraka turned his gaze from the shore to his third wife, who was sitting beside him on the central barge in Davy's merchant fleet. There's no change at all in the attitude of the people we've seen, she said. Those living in one part of the country have no idea what's going on in another. I don't see anything especially sad about that, Jiraka said. It's the same in the Confederacy. A disaster could hit one side of it and the other wouldn't know. At least we have officially circulated news, Mitra said. It's important for people to have a sense that they're part of something greater than themselves. Here, you just have tribesperson A from Tribe B of Clan C. It probably doesn't even go that far for most. A neighboring tribe could be wiped out and one wouldn't have any clue about it until someone just happened to trip over their remains. That much appeared to be true. Rolengork was a confederation in the most basic way. It was an association of thousands of tribes under hundreds of clans loosely acting as a single political entity. Rigid laws and a massive economy bound them domestically, but their regional projection was a mere fraction of a proper nation-state of the same size. Additionally, the behavior of Gorlia's defenders toward Davies suggested that the warrior caste kept its business strictly to itself. As a result, people only knew what they were supposed to know, which only included their own business and a very limited sense of events beyond their homes. That Ranadritha fellow seems to know what he's doing, Soraka said. We see Raz promoting his, well, let's just call it a venture, in every major holding. Bulking up, Jiraka said. Nothing more. They need to attract migrants to do whatever they want them to do, like a company starved for labor. Since the Inquisitor framed it that way, Soraka detached his idea of how a colonial company in the Confederacy operated from whatever Ranadritha was doing and thought about the scenario again. Rolengork's western neighbor was styled a kingdom, but the human countries that he knew of were at best minor polities that were part of a greater hegemony. Still, those countries were usually around 20 to 100,000 square kilometers in area. The largest one that he knew of was around 300,000, but it was essentially a massive ranch operated by pastoralist humanoid tribes who exported meat and dairy products to their neighbors. Karawaki, he said. If this draconic kingdom was about as large as the minor humanoid states that we know of, how many migrants do you think this Ranadritha should be aiming for? With Rolengork's industrial capabilities? Karawaki looked down at her open paw. Well, that would depend on a number of things. First of all, I can't imagine that these humans live in a jungle. They tend to form communities on open plains, which is excellent for raising livestock. One would have to have livestock suitable for raising in that environment. From what I've seen so far, the beastmen here don't have any. Trying to raise the same nugs that they ranch in the jungle in an environment ideal for humans would fail. The more likely strategy is integrating the humans after a new colonial government has been established. Do they even call them colonies here? Jiraka asked. That's beside the point, Karawaki said. It's one socio-political entity incorporating a foreign land and its inhabitants under their geo-economic oversight. The humans of the Draconic Kingdom will have industries of their own, So this Ranadratha should be taking advantage of that. Jaraka made a derisive noise. They turned to look over at where he and Kasturi were seated behind them. "You're giving them too much credit," he said. "You were there with the rest of us when those Eastern Ronos were discussing the topic. They're conquering those human lands and aim to replace them with the jungles that their industries work in. That doesn't sound like integration to me." Soraka and Karavaki shared a look over the Inquisitor's assertion. "That would be a colossal waste," Soraka said. "The objective of any productive conquest should be to capture as much territory, its residents and industries intact as possible. Rolengork has neither the resources nor time to restructure everything to their liking, nor should they." "Like I said," Jaraka crossed his arms, "you're giving them too much credit. Since no one can hear us in the middle of the river, I won't mince words. These guys are primitives, their calculations aren't so high level. You present anyone with something and they act according to what they know. And these guys don't know much. I'll bet you a platinum trade coin that they're mostly just eating humans and occupying the land like, well, tribes." Davy twisted in her seat with a horrified expression. But that's a waste. Do you know how much potential productivity a single human represents in their lifetime?" "Not really, no," Jaraka replied, "but I at least know that they're worth more than their value in meat, even if you sell it to a Minotaur. That's us talking about it, though, not these local beastmen. We're almost to their capital now, so we'll see soon enough." "What do you think about this, Mitra?" Davy asked. "Well, I didn't want to be premature," Mitra answered, "but I think Jaraka has the right idea. Kostarificaral probably absorbs all of the goods from the Draconic Kingdom that make it this far upriver, so there will be plenty of things that we haven't seen or heard of before. It wasn't the official capital, there wasn't one at all, but Kostarificaral was the political and economic center of the Confederation of Rolengork according to everyone they had spoken to. Early in the morning of their 22nd day out of Kira, the densely forested shores of the Rolengork widened dramatically to join a large lake. The body of water was vast enough that it stretched out to the horizon, though the peaks of distant mountain ranges to every side could still be seen. Their small fleet of barges followed the steady flow of traffic that rounded the lake's western shore, which eventually brought them into view of a metropolis sprawled over several dozen square kilometers of hilly terrain. "Oh hey," Jaraka said, "an actual city. Well, at least it's as big as a proper city." "The people who have actually been here kept on about how huge it is," Davy said, "but I wasn't sure whether to believe them or not. Maybe they'll have something worth our time here. Or we can wallow in the collective squalor of 250,000 beastmen." Kasturi's nose twitched. "You've seen how their other cities are designed." Maybe a part of it was the Gladestalker's preference for nature, but her point couldn't be ignored. Rolengork's civil engineering was rudimentary at best. Soraka rose from his seat as the barges paddled closer, trying to make sense of the city's layout. "This looks indefensible," he said. "Though I can't imagine any wilderness tribes attacking this place. I see fortified holdings on top of every hill, but it doesn't look like there are any towers in the cityscape between them." "You'd think with what's on their eastern border," Jaraka said, "that'd be one of the first problems they'd address. A dozen green dragons could gas this entire city overnight." "Well, as you've noted," Soraka said, "they're a civilization that hasn't developed an appreciation for more complex concepts yet. That includes aerial warfare." Honestly, they were not alone in that respect. Predatory races naturally saw magical beasts as competition rather than potentially exploitable assets. By the time their tribal societies had advanced to a point where they thought about using the local wildlife as mounts, creatures like griffins, wyverns, giant owls and other candidates for air cavalry would already be wiped out or driven away. Ones like Pegasi were considered food and would be long gone, as well. "How do we find a berth here?" "The merchants from our last stop said that there's some sort of system in place," Davy said. "There are 60 different wharves along the shore. The ones marked with red flags are full." "All right," Soraka said, "and then what?" "Then we pick out a pier." Soraka looked at the barges to the front and rear. Davy's fleet had grown to a dozen ships nearly filled to the waterline with goods. He hoped there would be space for all of them. A swarm of hawkers pressed in as their vessels bumped up against the wharf. Woven baskets of preserved meats, jugs of fresh water and all manner of simple goods were held out towards them. Despite the crudeness of it all, Davy's eyes scanned their offerings with an interest absent when they were presented with the martial dealings of the East. "It's more chaotic here," Davy said, "but I don't hate it." "We should have changed," Jirika grumbled. "Our outfits are attracting these buggers like flies to raw meat." "I guarantee that you'd have lost that battle," Soraka told him. "Still, they could have organized this port better." No matter where one was, they carried their instincts with them. This translated oddly sometimes, especially in societies as primitive as Rolengork. In the teeming cities, it became a case where the weak regularly hunted the strong, the powerful had the most resources, turning them into prey for the citizens selling goods and services. As members of the civilian castes had not yet appeared to master their instincts, this, in turn, led to instinctual reciprocation. Hawkers focused on one target at a time. Their unfortunate targets could sometimes be beset by 3 to 5 hawkers at once, leaving them thoroughly confused or even causing them to flee. Needless to say, it took a while to sort things out whenever he saw it happen. A young cow nearly stabbed him in the nose with a skewer of fish. Jirika's growl warned the young merchant away. Soraka idly wondered if the canine beastmen in Rolengork had an advantage over their felid counterparts, as they didn't share the same set of instincts. "Let's get out of here," Jirika said. "It isn't as if someone could hurt us in this crowd," Mitra said. "Stop scaring the locals." The Inquisitor sighed. As one of Soraka's bodyguards, the fact that so many potential assassins were allowed to come so close probably didn't sit well with him. Over the din of the crowd, the sound of one of Ranadratha's cries drew Soraka's attention. Much like the first city that they had visited, young beastmen gathered to listen intently to the message of opportunity waiting to be seized. Something he had taken for granted before the battles in the East crossed his mind. "Mitra. That's a performance, right?" "Yes, gee. Does that make this crier a bard? Or have they managed to develop some specialized vocation out of this sort of thing?" Performance was a blanket definition for all manner of supernatural abilities that revolved around the arts, oration and even combat. It was difficult for most to separate it from the mundane actions of everyday people, but once one learned how to identify it, one's guard was constantly raised against its use. Most who possessed the ability often did so unknowingly, but that didn't change the fact that it was being used. While most of it was benign enough, it could still sway minds and even coerce others into doing what they otherwise wouldn't do. "Are you implying that these criers are doing more than they should be?" Jirika asked. Performances had many gray areas, but acts of coercion and brainwashing were strictly illegal in the Beastman Confederacy. Since Rolengork almost certainly didn't know what was going on behind a bard's presentation, there were likely no laws to discourage them from employing its more insidious effects. "That would depend on how they're paid," Soraka said. "If there's some sort of quota for recruitment, I wouldn't put it past at least a few. Especially since the concept of oversight in this field is non-existent." "It doesn't have to be a selfish motive, either," Karawaki said. "Those acting out of self-interest usually have some sense that what they are doing is wrong and are wary of the repercussions, but those who believe that what they are doing is right will have few reservations." Soraka nodded in agreement. Karawaki's activism often brought her into contact with that sort. Many a charismatic figure and over-enthusiastic thug used their abilities to further what they believed was a just cause, but the ability to twist the free will of others more often than not led to reprehensible actions. They eventually squeezed their way out of the crowded waterfront. If a city in Rolengork was simply a larger town, then the capital was a larger version of the cities. As Mitra feared, the realities that came with it were not all pleasant. His third wife held a paw to her nose as they entered a squalid paupers district just beyond the wharf. "I hate how you pick these routes on purpose," she said. "It wouldn't be much of an assessment if we only associated with their elites," Soraka told her. Yes, Mitra snidely intoned, "the people that stand to benefit the most from a relationship with us are those of the common caste. You say that every time. And every time, the smell doesn't change." "Well, it's especially important to see what's going on in the capital of a country, yes?" Capital cities were a showcase of what a country and its people aspired to, and how those who failed in their aspirations ended up. The struggles and broken dreams of the common folk in the slums were just as important, if not more so, than any grand monuments, palatial estates or high-class districts. "You're probably thinking of something outrageously imperialistic," Jirika said. Can you blame me? Soraka replied, especially when the difference is so great. By the way, how do you think we should go about this? Dress down, for one thing, Jaraka said. Then pick a different district. We've already been marked in this one. As Mitra's complaints implied, it wasn't as if they hadn't done it before. The difference was that Rolengork was much larger than any other country they had visited in the lands beyond, and its capital was reflective of that. Most countries had capitals the size of Kira or smaller. Lead the way, Soraka said. Mitra will tear you apart if you dump us in a hut surrounded by refuse piles, though. They continued through the district under the pretense that they were visitors who didn't know their way around. The poorly constructed hovels of clay and cast-off timber created narrow alleys where the locals peeked out at them from the shadows of their homes. Soraka breathed a sigh of relief when they finally crossed into the next district. He was used to commanding the attention of tens of thousands, but the sort of attention he received from the impoverished residents wasn't something he enjoyed. Their looks of need and longing was something he could do little to remedy in the long term without the approval of his government. I like what the druids are doing back there, Karavaki said. There are druids? Soraka looked over his shoulder. You could see their influence. I'm sure we'll get another look. Unlike Mitra, Karavaki actively sought out the places where she felt that she could do the most good. He wondered what her reports to the Ashtapradhan would look like. How do you feel about tree branches? Jaraka asked. No, Mitra said. No, Devi joined in. No, Karavaki told him. The Inquisitor grumbled under his breath as he led them up the valley. They ascended to a higher elevation, and thus a higher class district. I didn't think the places back there were all that bad, Soraka said. And I guarantee you that your opinion doesn't matter, Jaraka replied. How about up there? Soraka followed Jaraka's gaze to an exposed cliff face overlooking a small river. While it wasn't a towering butte, it had a similar feel to Gaulia. Several stairways were carved out of the dark basalt, leading to entrances pockmarking the stone. They looked at Soraka's three wives. Let's see what the rooms look like, first, Devi said. The establishment was what looked like a mid to upper class inn in the city. Its proprietor took one look at them before scrambling over and leaping down from 10 meters above to offer his greetings. It looks like this Osalo race has innate acrobatic abilities. Acrobatics was another passive ability that people commonly mistook as mundane. In part, it was, but eliminating damage from a fall was more than simply landing the right way. Certain Felid beastmen had plenty of it, but others had none at all. The difference was in how they naturally hunted their prey. In the Beastman Confederacy, there was a somewhat similar race called the Tendua, though they were smaller than the Osalo and had different patterns to their rosettes. They also possessed high acrobatic abilities, which stemmed from their natural instinct to frequent the branches of trees. Welcome, good lord, the Osalo innkeeper bobbed his head repeatedly. I am called Itzli, the proprietor of the Kuroko's cliffs. My staff and I will be staying in the city for a while, Davy said to the side. Do you have vacancies for everyone? Or are reservations required? Reservations? Despite running an inn, the Osalo had no idea what a reservation was. Even knowing what Rolengork was like, many things that Soraka and his entourage took for granted were still assumed. Never mind, Davy said. May we take a look at your rooms before deciding? Of course. Please, this way. The accommodations were similar to those that Soraka had seen in Gaulia, which made him wonder whether the architects of the fortress were Osalo. Each room had wooden furnishings and space enough for 6. Davy hired rooms for each pair and their entourage, which pleased the proprietor to no end. Soraka and his wives took a larger suite on the highest level. He quickly changed into some of the local garb he had picked up at one of the holds along the Rolengork. It was a simple outfit of nug leather, over which he kept his belts and pouches. All right, let's get go. He turned to find that his wives were still fully dressed in their usual equipment. Their heads were close together as they talked about something in low voices. What are you three doing? Soraka said. Strategizing, Mitra replied. Strategizing. You can wait for us outside, G. Can in this case was will, so Soraka wordlessly left the room. He found Jaraka and Kasturi waiting on the walkway outside. Where are the other 3? Jaraka asked. Strategizing, apparently. You're lucky Kasturi doesn't. Kasturi entered Soraka's suite. They waited for a few minutes, but she didn't reappear with the others. Jaraka heaved a sigh. How many hours is this going to take? Who knows? Soraka replied, it's local common garb so it shouldn't. Well, no, never mind. Let's see what there is to see nearby. They descended to river level, where the Osalo innkeeper was sweeping the boardwalk with a long bundle of leaves. He looked up and visibly hesitated upon taking in their new appearance. Heading out to see the common districts? Itzli asked. We thought it best to not draw attention to ourselves if we wanted an authentic experience, Soraka explained. The innkeeper nodded. That seems wise, but it depends on where you plan on going. The appearance of wealth can be as much a shield as it can be a target here. Your entire group carries themselves with a dignified air, so none would accuse you of acting above your station should you dress according to it. I'm afraid we don't know much of what the big city is like, Soraka said. Are lords received in some special way here? That must mean you're from a warrior clan? From the east, perhaps? He frowned inwardly at the pointed distinctions being made, thinking back to what he had observed of the land and its people thus far. That's right, Soraka replied. We arrived from Kira. Before that, we were on the northern Yorgulan frontier. This place is very different from what we know. I see, the Osalo innkeeper said. Just as you warriors have your hierarchies of prestige, so do those of the other castes. Honestly, if you carry yourselves as warriors, I think people would mostly leave you alone. That's the opposite of what we want. We'd like to experience the city and all that it has to offer without being shunned or treated strangely. The innkeeper's tail moved curiously, and Soraka cringed internally. He was terrible at acting the part of a tourist, or maybe tourism was simply a foreign concept in Roland Gork. The markets, perhaps? The innkeeper scratched his chin. No, it must be the fighting pits. Soraka blinked at the unexpected tangent, but he went with it anyway. Where's the closest one? Not far from here. If you follow this river downstream, there will be another river that joins it about 500 meters from here. Follow that river upstream and you'll eventually see it on the left side. He thanked the innkeeper and wandered further down the boardwalk. His eyes scanned the stilted dwellings along the banks of the river, trying to make sense of the city. His line of questioning had been carelessly presumptive. Usually, when one appeared as a tourist in more civilized parts of the world, an innkeeper would either direct them to local establishments and industries that they were particularly proud of, or the appropriate tourist traps. The options in Korstorofi-Keral's common districts, however, were limited to either the markets or whatever the fighting pits were. Given the apparent development of Roland Gork, he should have expected nothing in terms of sights for their non-existent tourists to see. So entertainment is limited to fighting, experiencing the markets and, what? Maybe the upper-class districts have something more. The innkeeper hadn't even mentioned any temples that they might want to visit. Overall, spirituality appeared to be weak in Roland Gork, with no true organized religions to speak of. Worship was either personal or limited to major events. See anything interesting in those slums we passed through? Soraka asked. Nothing I haven't seen before, Jaraka answered with a flick of his ear. Why does the fact that I grew up in the slums make me some sort of connoisseur of them? You do prefer cities? Sure, the Inquisitor said, but it's not as if I pine for the squalor of home like Castoria pines for pristine natural environments. I still have no idea how you two got together. Me neither. Not that I'm complaining about it. Davy appeared with the other wives in tow 40 minutes later. For all of the time they took to prepare, Soraka couldn't figure out what was so special about their appearance. They were dressed in the same type of nug leather garb as the other females he had seen in the capital, which only consisted of a few more articles of clothing than everywhere else they had been in Roland Gork. So, Mitra elegantly twirled in place, how do we look? Fine. His three wives flattened their ears at his response. What? He asked. Nothing, Mitra answered. Having multiple wives provided him with absolutely no advantage in interpreting females over those with none. He turned to exchange a look with Jaraka, except Jaraka had prudently stalked off ahead somewhere to avoid the same fate. Well, Soraka forced some enthusiasm into his voice, we have a lot to see. I hope everyone likes fighting pits. For some reason, his three wives grew even more sullen.